All right, so today we are going to talk about some stuff that came out in the news recently that will affect home care agencies. All right, so the federal court ordered Christian Home Health Care to pay more than 500 workers $1.6 million in wages and damages. All right, so let's talk about what all of this means. Let's talk about a little bit of the history. This falls under the Fair Labor Standards Act. All right, so just a little bit of history. This act was established in 1938 and it gave the president certain powers. All right, and one of the things that were done during the Obama administration were certain rules about overtime, who qualifies, who doesn't, how do you apply these. And we're not going to get into all the details, all right, but it affected a lot of different people. And one of the big issues that came from this is how it affected home care. So, those of you that are familiar with the home care industry and everyone, and at one point, a very popular service was the live-in service. Live-in caregivers were billed out. The service was billed out on a daily rate, anywhere from 150 to $200, depending on where you were in the country. And the caregivers were paid anywhere from $75 to $120 per day, again, depending on where you are in the country. So, what this means is that you were able to generate a decent amount of profit for providing this service. Because of the fact that it was a daily rate, it did not really make a difference as to the number of hours that the caregiver would work. So, what did this mean? This would mean that if the caregiver woke up 4 or 5 times in the night because the client had to get up, it was okay. You would just speak to the client, you would address it, but to the client's family. But in the end, you were still able to staff the case with one caregiver and the margins would still be present. So in 2015, when these changes were made to the act, all right, essentially the caregivers, the live-in caregivers became hourly employees. Okay, now, that meant that you could no longer just get away with classifying these caregivers as, 1099 contract employees, or you couldn't just say they fall under the exemption of live-in staff. All right. So what does this mean? Fast forward, President Trump's administration, the Labor Department, the Department of Labor federally, they rescinded a lot of the changes made by the Obama administration during, to the overtime rule. The one thing they did not do was remove the exemption for home care. They left this in place, meaning that even though the thresholds for and what the measuring stick, so to say, for what was considered a salaried employee and where the exemption was to paying overtime was put in place for companies such as McDonald's or something else, and where a manager, even though they did a lot of the same work as the person flipping a burger, all right, they were, because they were in a supervisory role, as long as they met the threshold of about $26,500 per year, they were able to remain salaried, and they were not entitled to overtime. As so, the test for this, the sort of the benchmark for this was lifted a little bit, and it allowed smaller companies to do this. Now, when it came to healthcare, because there is a concept, a basic principle when it comes to home health aides. And this principle is called waiting to engage, meaning, even though a caregiver is working actively for a certain number of hours, even if the client is asleep, the caregiver is considered in a state of waiting to engage. And this basic principle means that the caregiver could be interrupted from their break or rest at any given moment in order to care for the client because of the client's needs. Now, I got to stop here for a minute, and I have to make this very clear. I am not an attorney. I am not some human resources expert. I am not licensed in any way. This is based on my own understanding and experience of how these labor laws work. Okay, I got to make this clear. If you have any questions or concerns about how things work for you specifically in your region, okay, whether in the US or outside of the US, please check with your local laws, okay, and find yourself an employment attorney that can help you navigate this, or contact your local labor department. So now moving on this explanation, as it was made to be understood, this really killed the service of live-in care in a lot of areas. A lot of people just weren't doing it because a lot of questions come up when we're dealing with this. One big question is, well, if they're hourly, can I just give them a fixed number of hours? How do I track it? Because now you're running into a question of fairness and of employee retention. So let's say you have, a caregiver that's only realistically working about 4 to 5 hours a day, but they're living in the client's home. Are you only going to pay them those 4 or 5 hours? All right. How do you pay them the rest? Well, what the federal government did, and now this greatly varies from state to state, but what the federal government did was they established a baseline. It was about 12 hours. Okay. So you have to pay them a minimum of, no, you have 12 hours um, in order to satisfy the federal need. Now, some states are demanding 16, some are others, but they set out these guidelines. And I'll include a link to the Department of Labor booklet right off of their website in the somewhere attached to this, depending on where you're listening to it. It'll be in the description or in the comment section. And but what this is coming down to is it's about 12 to 16 hours depending on where you are, if you're following the federal limits or whatever. But one of the guidelines is they have to have 5 hours of uninterrupted rest. So now that doesn't mean that they have to sleep between certain hours of the night. It's just that once the time has been declared that the caregiver is on their sleep break, that they must not be bothered. If they are, then the exemption is lifted and it'll be paying them for 21 hours. All right. Uh, Now, why 21 hours? That seems like a very specific number. Well, because they're also entitled to 3 hours of breaks. All right. Now, this is where it gets complicated. A live-in caregiver really should not be leaving the client alone, but at the same note, when they're taking their break, it should be a time in which they are not expected to engage with the client. All right. And this is where it gets a little complicated. So, again, what some companies did in order to maintain the live in service is that they started classifying their live in caregivers as independent contractors, okay, instead of employees. This company here, Christian Home Health, is not the only company to have done this. All right. And they just happened to get caught classifying 546 as independent contractors instead of employees. And by doing so, they thought they can get away with not paying them overtime. All right. So, how does this work if you are following the law? Well, if you're doing the 13-hour recommended standard, then what you are doing is essentially you're paying 91 hours a week, 13 hours a day, 7 days a week, in which um, the first 40 hours are at straight time, and 51 hours of overtime per week. And you have to be able to price yourself accordingly. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, but you need to be able to track these hours, and there's a number of ways to do it. You can actually have the caregiver clock in and out. You can just make sure that they're tracking their hours and have it signed off by the client, paper timesheets. There's 100 ways to take this. There's even an option. There's a website called timesheets.com that you can actually set up an account with them. I think they're relatively inexpensive as long as you're keeping it low, and they can do it through their phone. Or there's 100 other solutions. Your payroll company might be a good people to have a conversation with. But being able to understand how to set this up will actually allow you the opportunity to offer this service, especially now. Look, people are like, CMS just announced at the time of this recording, I believe it was about a week ago, that they are lifting the restrictions. And at the time I'm making this recording, they have loosened some of the restrictions, and visitation is allowed again at these facilities. So, from a marketing perspective, that means you potentially can go back to visit facilities again. You have to check with each individual facility to see what their policies are on this. But from a visitation point of view, that means a lot of this isolation is opening. And this also means that now a lot of the people that saw that the loved ones were heavily isolated will be removing their loved ones from these assisted livings and from these independent livings. Now, this is terrible news if you're an independent living owner or an assisted living owner. But if you're a home care agency operator, this is potentially great news for you, because now you can potentially see an uptick in business. So let's take a look at this. Depending on where you are in the world, in the United States specifically, we're going to talk about live-in care. So your average assisted living, bare bones service will cost anywhere from $4,000 to $7,000 per month. If you can provide live-in care, you're looking at charging anywhere from $5,000 to $8,000 per month. Now, that's comparably priced to your basic live-in service. But if you want to take it a step further, the level of care, that one-to-one attention that they'll receive with you, will be much higher. So now it comes a matter of, is it worthwhile? Well, it really depends on a couple of things. Number one, are you in an area where you can readily find caregivers that are open to living in someone's home? There's ways to do this. There's recruitment campaigns and a very specific way to explain this to a caregiver that can make it worth their while. You have to ask yourself next, is the are the labor laws in my state or in my region friendly to live-in caregiving service? Is it beneficial to you as an agency operator? Well, if the answer, I'm going to say in most states it is, as long as you're tracking things properly. Okay. So, and if you have a way to set all of this up the right way, yeah, in most states it is. I wouldn't recommend this again, check with your labor attorney on how this works. But if memory serves me correctly, I wouldn't recommend live-in service in a state like California, because they have a daily overtime law in addition to a weekly overtime law. And from my understanding, again, please, 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 I cannot stress this enough. Check with your labor attorney or your labor department to make sure. Do not take my word for this. But if I'm not mistaken, in California, they have a daily overtime rate of 9 or 10 hours, depending on the classification of work. And that would not be friendly to you as a home care agency owner. But in most other states, not all, but most, this is actually a viable business, as long as you understand how to attract the caregivers and how to explain the value to the client. Is it something to consider? I would say yes. Okay. Just simply because, again, you're looking at the difference between a client that is requesting 168 hours a week and a client that's requesting a live-in caregiver has to do with a couple of key points. point number one is the level of need of the client. Just because someone is requesting a live-in caregiver, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into place with putting this program in together. Um, but one of the keys to this is understanding the client's need and desire. How comfortable is the client with having somebody live in their home? Another big factor is the cost. If we're looking at your average hourly rate of $23.50 an hour, we're looking at anywhere from $15,000 to $17,000 a month because you're looking at 168 hours. So for the cost to the client, it's a lot cheaper because you're looking at about half the cost, and they'll have a caregiver there ever present. Now, from a caregiver, from a agency owner point of view, and again, I'll be linking a lot of stuff in the description or in the comments as to how this works, so you can research it yourself. All right. Actually, you know what? I think I might just include it in a blog post that'll be. You can visit us on at thebrionesgroup.com. All right, and look for our blog post that will be associated to this video. I'll link that into the description. This way you can get all the resources that I'm talking about, the Department of Labor handbook and some other things that you can look at. um, but when it comes to all of this, you're looking at a big issue or a big difference in, how are you going to make this profitable? Yes, if you're looking at hourly and you're maintaining proper margins of anywhere from 40 to 50% as a gross margin, yeah, hourly is going to be much more profitable for you. But the thing is that most people that need 168 hours a week worth of care, that means a minimum of 6 caregivers that you have to put onto that case versus one on a live-in. And if you're looking at from a profit perspective, yeah, your hourly profit will be higher, but usually people with a living caregiver tend to last longer. And also, if depending on where you are and the type of client that it is, a living caregiver is usually more beneficial to someone with some sort of cognitive issue, where the continuity of care and the continuity of the caregiver is of the utmost importance. You can also, if the client has an issue with sleeping, you can also do this with like an overnight shift so that your live-in caregiver gets sufficient rest, and this will increase your billing and it'll still come out to be cheaper for the client. So it's all about finding solutions to meet your client needs. All right. So this has been my whole thing. Just please be careful and understand that just because you want to skirt the law and classify your caregivers as independent contractors, it doesn't mean that this is what's going to work. And as always, again, as I've said it a dozen times in this video, please, please, please contact your labor attorney. Make sure you're doing things properly. Stay safe and keep your business running. Thank you very much.